going on already. So happy to answer specific questions about that campaign or those campaigns if you have them, and if you're stuck trying to engage with an MP or a group, or if you just have any questions about kind of that specific campaign, happy to answer them. But if you have any more general questions as well, I'm more than happy to answer them. Probably best put them in the chat, and at the end of the call, I'll go through them and then can have a discussion about those when we get to the end. Hopefully Wi-Fi, computer, etc. lasts for the whole hour and 15. You know what it's like. Feels like the weather today has been playing havoc with everything. But without further ado, I will get going. So thank you for the intro, Ellen. I am Mark Edwards. So I worked for 3 years in Parliament for two different MPs. With them, I worked on a number of campaigns and issues, including violence against women and girls and women in the armed forces. My overriding impression of, working for an MP was it's a really busy life for an MP. It's difficult. They have lots of competing aims. And I think from the perspective of campaigners and those that are trying to get a message across, that's something really important to remember. And I will come to that later in the presentation. I think it also has made me realize that parliamentary staffers can be a real key to getting influence with MPs. So if you're ever at an event or you ever come across a parliamentary staffer, try and make friends with them, build them into your network. I think they can be really important ways in. So, for example, MPs usually receive about 300 to 500 emails a day, and probably the first port of call for, reading and looking at and triaging those emails is going to be it's going to be a parliamentary staffer. So I think if you ever get the opportunity to if you ever meet a parliamentary staffer and you can try and make them your friend, make them your professional friend at least, I think that's quite a good thing to do, and can be really helpful for any campaigns. After working in Parliament, I spent a year and a half working for a political party covering business engagement and business-focused policy making. And I've recently joined an electric vehicle startup working on related policy and UK government affairs. So I'm sort of somewhat practicing what I preach now with this kind of presentation, and using my experiences from Parliament and my previous roles in my job currently. I'm by no means an expert on any of this, and happy to be proven wrong on anything that I might say, but also happy to give insights where appropriate and where helpful. So as I said, will be time for questions at the end, and happy to take them on as many topics as you might have questions on. Also happy to go away after this and chat further with anyone who has any specific questions that they don't want to ask on this meeting, or that we don't have time for. So the first bit that Ellen sort of asked me to cover, which I hope will be helpful in getting everyone to a kind of baseline level of knowledge on what we'll be covering and what might be of interest to you, is some of the kind of jargon around Westminster. And Westminster is, it's known as a bit of a bubble. I think people do operate in a bubble in Westminster, and that also means there's often quite a lot of language that gets bandied about that I think a lot of people, that are newbies to the Westminster world, won't necessarily understand or appreciate. And I would also say, don't let a kind of lack of knowledge or understanding put you off engaging with parliamentarians. I think you do not need to know everything about how Parliament works to be able to engage with parliamentarians and to be able to make your campaign or your policy heard. So I think don't be put off in any way whatsoever by some of the jargon, or even maybe the negative stories that you see about what Parliament's like. I think there are lots of really good people there, and lots of people who want to listen to folks like yourselves who might have an interesting point to put across, or might have kind of something to put across that's going to make a material difference to the country and to their constituents, and so on. So policy is a really broad term, really, for any laws, regulations, guidelines that shape the actions of government, parliament, and the wider political ecosystem. So this can be anything from manifestos. So, for example, a political party will usually put out a manifesto before a general election in which they lay out what they would do if they were to get into government. And this is really just a kind of an outlay of their policy of what they feel they would do on certain issues. However, as we all know, it's not necessarily a guide to what laws they would actually change if they were to get into government. So we like to think that, you know, political parties, if they get into government, will always stick by every single manifesto pledge. As we all know, that doesn't necessarily happen. And also, governments don't necessarily have time to do everything that they say they want to do. So that's why manifestos are more of a wide-ranging policy than they are a kind of a specific piece of legislation or a specific law. Other policy kind of examples of policy include policy papers. So think tanks might put out a policy paper on a specific issue, or governments might also release policy papers. So, for example, in my line of work at the moment, we're waiting on a policy paper from the government on their industrial strategy. And this industrial strategy will put out how the government will seek to support various elements of UK industry. The industrial strategy itself won't necessarily have specific legislation within it, so it won't necessarily result in any laws changing, but it will give a kind of overarching view of what the government's policy perspective is on various issues. Conversely, legislation, so that's a law or set of laws that have been passed by Parliament. So that legislation is something that has specifically gone through Parliament. There are various mechanisms through which legislation can change. The main one you'll see, though, is via a full parliamentary bill. So when it's called a bill, that is when a piece of legislation is in progress in Parliament. So that means MPs are scrutinising it, and then peers members of the House of Lords will be scrutinising it. And then it will finally become an act of Parliament when the King, well, when it passes all stages in Parliament and then the King kind of signs it off and rubber stamps it. That's when it becomes an act of Parliament and is therefore law. The confusing thing is, and I'll again come to this on the next slide, is when something becomes an act of Parliament and therefore law, it doesn't mean it's necessarily been implemented. So there's a slight difference between it becoming legislation and actually being implemented. So an example of this is in the Environment Act, which was passed in 2021. Various elements of the Environment Act did not officially become law immediately. There was a kind of implementation period over the time in which they actually became law and changed the way that, you know, organizations or individuals actually had to act. So it is a very complicated process, but I think, you know, on a high level, it's kind of easy to remember that a bill is when it's going through Parliament and an act is when it's actually become law and is therefore, you know, more likely to actually affect change. And then we have Parliament. So Parliament sits in the Palace of Westminster, which I'm sure you will all see on or will have seen on news and may even have visited at some point. Parliament is made up of the House of Commons, which is MPs who are elected. So there are 650 MPs, and all of us have the opportunity to elect an MP. For example, as we did last July in that previous general election. And then there's the House of Lords. This is made up of peers, and they're unelected. Peers are usually people who have done something of note in their career or have a particular interest in something. So I think people often, when they're thinking about engaging parliamentarians, and they often think about how would you engage MPs? However, I think it's really important to think about how you might engage members of the House of Lords as well, because they also have a very important role in scrutinizing legislation and also in affecting affecting conversations that are going on in Parliament on certain issues. So really important to remember the House of Lords as well. And I'll come on to a bit more about how you can engage them later. And then finally, you've got the government. So the government is separate to Parliament, but the government is comprised of parliamentary representatives, usually of the largest party in the House of Commons. So at the moment, the government is made up of Labour MPs and Labour members of the House of Lords. More members of government sit in the House of Commons than are in the House of Lords, but there is a cross section across both. So, you know, the government will be people like the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, or the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs and his team. Those are kind of that's the government, and whereas Parliament is all of your MPs and peers. So there are kind of various stages of policy making, which cuts across lots of different aspects of the kind of Westminster ecosystem. And I've tried to distill it down to kind of a broad pattern. However, policy making is complex and driven by various actors. So it's not quite as simple as these bullet points might suggest. But I think I find it quite useful to simplify it down because I think it makes it easier to see how you might be able to engage with parliamentarians or organizations as part of that process. Also, I think, it's worth remembering that policy making is a really iterative process. So actually, as you work through all of those stages of the policy making process, once you get to the bottom, you actually come back around to the top again. And I think if I do this presentation again, I should actually show this as a kind of circular flow chart because I think that might better represent the process. But it starts, and if we, start from the first bullet point, it starts with kind of the identifying of issues. So, the government or an MP or organizations like UK Youth for Nature or individuals might identify an issue, a problem that needs addressing. Um, might be might need addressing through government action or the action of regulators or the action of other public bodies. So you identify an issue and you set out what that issue is, and you might set that out via a political campaign, or if you're a think tank, they might set that out through a research paper. You then need to get that issue and the fact that that issue exists heard by government if you're an organization like yourselves where you're not necessarily you don't have control over the levers of actually making that change directly. You need to get that issue heard and recognized by government. The government will then prioritize all of these issues that require governmental action. So they will set an agenda for what's most important for them. And I think at this point, it's really important to remember that if you're trying to engage government and you need government action on something, it's worth trying to align any campaign that you're working on with some of the government's agenda and with what with what the government is particularly interested in. So for example, at the moment, the government has its 5 missions. So these are kind of its 5 core values that it wants to do over the next 5 years until the next election, or the kind of the values that it wants to live by and govern by. So for example, on those, if you can find a way in which your campaign links in with one of those missions, then you stand yourself in better stead of being prioritized when the government comes to kind of prioritizing issues and setting an agenda for the legislative program that it has in Parliament. I think at this point it's worth noting as well that the government holds a lot of power over the legislative agenda in Parliament. So if your issue needs changing via legislation, so the law needs to be changed for there to be a solution or an improvement on the issue, then you will need government backing for that piece of legislation. It's very, very difficult for backbench MPs to have any legislation changed as a result of any work that they do. Everything really has to go through the government, and the government has control over the kind of legislative agenda. So that's always worth remembering when it comes to any kind of campaigns you're working on. Once there's been a kind of, agenda setting, prioritizing of issues, you then kind of go on to the more granular policy formation stage. So this is about developing solutions or strategies. It will usually be government departments that are kind of working on this. If it's a policy that the government is progressing through legislation. So, as part of that, government departments will listen to external stakeholders. There'll be, consultation phases where they listen to the views of external stakeholders. And again, this is a really good opportunity for organizations and individuals to feed in their views. So I give an example of something that I've been working on recently. There is a mandate called the Zero Emissions Vehicles Mandate. And that is the mechanism through which the government is trying to encourage the uptake of electric vehicles, EVs. And there's recently been a change to that mandate. And as part of the process of changing the mandate, the government sought views from businesses across the country as to how that might impact them. And generally the government takes on the views of these consultations and listens to the views of businesses and other organizations that might respond to the consultation when it is coming to kind of policy formation. So, really worth engaging with policy even when it's past the kind of initial stages, because government may come out and say that they want to do X and this is what they think the solution is. But until the legislation has actually passed through Parliament, there is still opportunity to change it, and government will be listening to how it can change it and how it can potentially make the legislation suit the needs better. And then that's where we come into the decision-making phase. So this is the kind of legislative process where policy is debated, amended, and approved. And then this is where MPs and peers and those in Parliament can have a larger voice, because they will get the opportunity to speak in Parliament on an issue. And as I said earlier, there's many stages to legislation and the process by which it goes through Parliament and big bills. So, I referenced the Environment Act earlier. That took, I think, about 18 months to go through Parliament because it was such a big, weighty piece of legislation, which means that kind of legislative process phase can be a really long period. Which means that it also provides a really good opportunity and a really good window of opportunity for organizations to engage on the kind of granular level of the legislation. Then there's the implementation phase. So, putting policies into action, and that's when something's become law and you're seeing those policies actually working or not working, which is where you come into the evaluation stage. And that's kind of around assessing the effectiveness of the policy and around assessing where improvements might need to be made. And I think that's where you come back to the beginning again, because no policy is perfect, no legislation is perfect. And once you've gone through those 6 stages, there's always an opportunity to go back to the beginning again and identify an issue, identify something that's not necessarily working. And I think it's really, really worth remembering that when you are looking at building a campaign, because just because something has already gone through Parliament doesn't mean there might not be opportunities to improve it further down the line. So I think obviously a really big aspect of what we're talking about this evening is how can you impact policy making. And I think you're probably all on the call today because you have a campaign or an issue or an idea that you're interested in forwarding, you're interested in engaging parliamentarians and also wider stakeholders with. So the big one is engaging with your MP and wider parliamentarians. I will come to that further. I've got a few slides on that, but I think it's worth remembering that the MPs and parliamentarians are not the only ways through which you can get your voice heard. I think social media, obviously, it goes without saying, is a really big avenue for driving campaigns. You've also got traditional print broadcast media, so getting press releases out in print media, or getting op-eds in print media, or getting yourself out on broadcast media as well. None of this is easy, and you often need to start local. So it's not always you're not always going to end up getting your name or your story or your campaign splashed across the front page of the Times, with immediacy. It might take you a while to get there, but you can start small, you can start local, you can start low. And I think it's really important to remember that there are big networks out there for kind of local print media, and also broadcast media as well. So look at local first, and that can be a really good way of getting your campaign out there. Mobilizing the public. So campaign days or encouraging people to sign a petition. A really good example of this that I was thinking about earlier is the campaign that's currently going on around limiting or banning the use of mobile phones in schools for those that are under 16. So I've been personally very surprised by how rapidly that campaign has grown. It's now something that's been picked up by the opposition in Parliament, so the Conservative Party are running with it in quite a big way. I don't think this time last year there were parliamentarians talking about that campaign in the same way, but that started in a kind of ground up manner. And it started by mobilizing kind of the public in small WhatsApp groups, I believe. It started in small sort of local WhatsApp groups where parents would add their friends in and they'd be sharing stories about, the impacts of social media on under 16s and children. And that's a campaign that's really grown quite considerably recently. And you would have seen it's now sort of really taking a front seat in terms of public discourse. That has, there are many ways in which that's grown. But I think the kind of local and public support that that campaign had is really a testament to, or it's really a core facet as to why it's been so successful. Then there are events you can run, and I know UK Youth for Nature are, very active with parliamentary events and other events in the Senedd in Cardiff and across the country. These sorts of events are really good ways of collaborating with others who are interested, getting people in a room together and discussing issues that are important to you and to your organization. You can also write reports and policy papers, and I think these can be a really good way of distilling complex arguments or issues into something quite clear, bringing case studies, and then providing policy answers as well to your questions. And I think policy papers, reports, and such is something that sort of think tanks and those within the Westminster ecosystem do quite well. They can be quite weighty sometimes, but they can be a really good way of drawing attention to an issue. I think it's worth saying as well that successful campaigns will usually involve some or all of the above methods of engagement. So, you're not necessarily going to be successful by only having one of these modes of engagement. You probably will need a lot. I think also worth remembering that you're not in this alone. So collaboration with other organizations that have similar values or shared or are looking for shared outcomes is a really important way of kind of showing working together and showing support for the campaign that you're working on. I think bringing people together and bringing and mobilizing a large group of people is really key to policy making. And I will come on to that later in terms of political engagement and engaging with MPs. So, as I said earlier, um, engaging with your MP is a really valid and valuable experience. I think MPs get a pretty tough rap sometimes. I think there's a lot of stories, and in many cases, rightly so, about MPs and behaviour and, not necessarily caring about their constituents or the country and all of that. And I think actually, in my experience anyway, I worked for two MPs who were highly engaged with their constituents and who worked on, really interesting campaigns and that I think made a difference to the lives of their constituents and those more widely across the UK. So do not be disheartened. And I think engaging with your MP is a really important, valuable thing to do. And there's lots of ways you can do that. So I think the first one is writing to your MP. Every MP has an email address that you can write to them. You can even write a letter to them. Weirdly, I think sometimes now, because more people email their MPs than write to them, sometimes actually a handwritten letter can be more impactful. The letters, in my experience, definitely did all get read. Emails, not necessarily so. So I think it's actually something interesting to think about is when you're engaging your MP to begin with is whether actually you do write an email or a letter. I think sometimes both is probably best, but definitely something to consider. Um, and as I said, anyone can write to their MP. Anyone can write to an MP. It doesn't have to actually be your MP that you write to. And I'll come on to that later. But the one thing I would just caution on is MPs do receive lots of correspondence. So don't be disheartened if you don't get an immediate response. It doesn't mean that your issue is not worthy, it's not worthy of their time, or it's not worthy of their interest. it is sometimes a facet of how busy an MP is and how busy their staff are. And I think that's why, a range of engagement methods is really important as well. Um, Attending surgeries is another engagement method. So MPs used to, and most still do, hold surgeries or what they call surgeries. And this is where constituents can meet them face to face to discuss concerns or ask questions, etc. The nature of these has changed post-COVID, and as I'm sure you will all be aware, after some security incidences with MPs. Obviously, this means that security is much higher at MP surgeries, and the kind of nature of how some MPs look to hold their surgeries has changed. However, most MPs do still hold surgeries in some way or another. There'll probably be 10 to 15-minute sessions where you can discuss a problem or an issue that you have. I would say most MPs tend to ask for your issue beforehand. So they'll say to you, what do you want to discuss? And that is their method of triaging whether it's, something they will speak to you in person about or not. Sometimes they may turn around and say, actually, I think this is better dealt with over email. And again, you can definitely say that you'd like to speak to them in person if that's what you'd prefer to do to try and put your campaign or your point across. But you won't necessarily be able to get that. And I think um, again, don't be disheartened. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're not interested in your campaign. It just means that they're probably prioritizing what they might see as more urgent casework. So this could be things like people who need help with their housing or people who need help accessing kind of urgent medical attention. Those are the sort of people that would more likely be offered at first choice a surgery with their MP. Um, but as I said, social media is obviously a really impactful way of engaging people more widely, but it's also a really good way of engaging MPs too. So many MPs are active on social media, may respond to tweets, Facebook posts, Instagram comments, etc. And LinkedIn is also an increasingly powerful tool, I've noticed. I think many MPs are on LinkedIn now and they're sharing their work on LinkedIn. So, contacting your MP via social media. So, for example, if you were to put out a post about a campaign you were doing and tagging your MP in it, that might be a really good way of getting your campaign seen by an MP. Um, as I said, yeah, so social media is an accessible and immediate way of contacting an MP and raising awareness of an issue. But I would also team any social media engagement with, emails and other methods of engagement too, because um, like all of us, there are lots of MPs who will be scrolling their social media. They might see something, think it's interesting, think, oh yeah, I'll do something about that, and then they forget about it 5 minutes later. We've all been there. MPs are exactly the same. So it's worth kind of following up with an email as well, and also having that regular humdrum of activity on your social media just to increase the chances of it being seen more than once. Um, and then you can also ask your MP to visit you. So MPs are also always looking for visit ideas. Fridays are days when Parliament doesn't tend to sit. So MPs are normally in their constituencies, and most MPs will try and get out and about as much as possible within their constituency so they can meet people and see what's going on. And if you've got something you can show, so a site or a workshop that you're doing that they can come along to, that can be a really useful way of engaging with them. And I think, having something visual is always really helpful to help MPs get a better understanding of what it is that you're trying to achieve or what it is that you're doing. And I should say this is, engaging, I've written here engaging with your MP, but this also counts for engaging members of the House of Lords as well. So, you can write to members of the House of Lords. how members of the House of Lords tend not to hold surgery sessions because they don't necessarily represent anyone. They don't have a constituency that they represent. However, in my experience, if a member of the House of Lords, if a peer is interested in an issue, they may well say, well, I can, let's do a Zoom or a face-to-face, and we can discuss this further. So I think you can also contact a peer and via any of these means and try and kind of entice them to learn more about your campaign. Um, and it also doesn't need to be your MP that you engage with, that you email. So, we all live where we all live, we're all represented by an MP, but engaging with parliamentarians more widely is also a really important and useful means through which you can spread the knowledge and spread interest in your campaign. So, working upwards and working sort of from most important downwards in a sense. Um, there's secretaries of state and ministers. So, you know, as I said earlier, we've got Steve Reed, who is the Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Him and his team of ministers work on a lot of the issues that UK Youth for Nature will be interested in. There will be lots of other secretaries of state and ministers that I'm sure Ellen and her team and others on the call will be working with. So, you don't have to just because your name is UK Youth for Nature, you don't have to only engage with kind of one department. There will be lots of secretaries of state and ministers that might have an interest in the work that you're doing. But with that in mind, make sure your campaign directly links to their work. Obviously, secretaries of state are not going to pick something up if it's not directly related to their work specifically. And again, it's worth remembering that you can email a Secretary of State, and if you type in email address for Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, you should be able to get a generic kind of post box email that all of their correspondence goes to. That won't necessarily be picked up, or it most definitely won't be picked up by them, but it will be picked up by their correspondence team in their department. But it's still a good way of making your voice heard, and sometimes uh, it might elicit further correspondence and further kind of conversations with the department in question too. So it can be a helpful way. And obviously, at the end of the day, you will need the support of the secretaries of state and the government more widely to see a successful campaign go through if you need legislation to enact that change. So, as part of any engagement, possibly further down the line, it's always worth thinking about how you can engage the government in your work. Then you have select committees. So select committees are cross-party groups that sit in Parliament. There are select committees made up of MPs. There are separate ones made up of peers. And they are committees that are focused on scrutinising the work of the government, and they scrutinise the government departments. So they scrutinise specific issues. So, for example, there is a select committee that scrutinises the work of DEFRA. There's a select committee that scrutinises the work of the Treasury, Department of Trade and Business, and so on and so on. And the way these work is select committees normally take up inquiries. So, for example, the Environment Select Committee a number of years back took up a very important inquiry on river pollution and particularly sewage pollution and how you tackle that. And that was one of the big catalysts for the wider conversation that's happening in Parliament currently and more widely. And UK Youth for Nature are doing work on this as we speak around chemicals and other kind of pollutants in our rivers. So select committees do have a really important role in the wider dialogue and the wider kind of policy narrative around the work of government and around what's going on in Parliament. So engaging with them can be a really important way and a really useful way of putting your campaign across. So people to engage on that would be the chair, the members of the committee. So there's a chair for every committee, and then there's a membership made up of MPs or peers from across all political parties. And then it's also worth trying to make contact as well with the officials that work behind the scenes on select committees. So all select committees have a group of people that work behind the scenes, sort of helping to do the administration of the committee, write the reports and so on, and they can be a really useful they can be really useful contacts for you for if you would like a committee to take up a particular issue. And then you also have chairs and members of APPGs. So APPGs are all-party parliamentary groups. They are cross-party groups that look at specific issues. So you've got the committee, oh, sorry, the APPG on climate change, the APPG for the environment, and there are, I think, and they've recently changed the rules around APPGs, but they are normally made up of 5 MPs or peers who are the kind of the core of the APPG. But then those APPGs will normally host events which then bring together other MPs and peers. So if there are any APPGs that are particularly focused on any issues that you are focusing on, then can also be worth engaging with them to see if there's any work that you can do together. Um, I think generally APPGs are increasingly they are becoming kind of a respected aspect of parliamentary affairs. I think there used to be lots of APPGs which did things like there was APPGs for specific countries, and they got a bit of a reputation for being vehicles through which people could get free trips to other countries. And I think some of that's now subsided, and generally APPGs are much more respected and have more teeth and more power to actually kind of change some of the narrative around certain policies. Particularly, I think the environment APPG being one, which does have a really good standing in the kind of wider policymaking environment. And then there's opposition spokespeople as well. So, for example, the Conservative Party now is the opposition, and there are people on the Conservative Party who shadow every Secretary of State. So I give the example of the Shadow Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. She has taken up the mantle of this kind of wider discontent among the farming community towards some of the government's policies. She has taken up the mantle and made it quite a core part of what she's doing. So she's really run with that. And I think where there are opportunities for you to maybe engage with the opposition, whether it be the official opposition, so the Conservative Party, or other opposition MPs, so Lib Dems, the Green Party, Reform, if you're so inclined, and the various other political parties that sit on the kind of the opposite side of the house to the government. All of those, if there are people on that side of the house who have particular interests in what you're doing and aren't captured by any of the other categories, so select committee chairs, members, etc., members of the APPGs, then they're equally useful tools to forward any parliamentary and political campaigns. And then also, it's worth just looking at Hansard to see who's spoken on a particular issue. So Hansard is a record of what's been spoken in Parliament, and there's a tool through which you can search for keywords, etc. And so, for example, if you're interested in river pollution, it might be worth looking at that to see who's spoken on the matter of river pollution. And you could use that as a means through which you can engage parliamentarians. It's also a really good way of understanding what particular issues certain MPs might be particularly interested in. Um, and finally, I think how to make your message stand out. As I said, parliamentarians and their staff are bombarded by emails, and there are various ways you can make it stand out. And I, said earlier that one way in which some things stand out is coming via a letter rather than coming via email. That's an example. But I think, and I was thinking about this earlier, is there are 3 ways in which I think you can really help your cause. So firstly, a constituency focus. So, how is this relevant to their constituency? Can you give an example that directly links this campaign to the MP's constituency? Obviously, this is more relevant to MPs than it is to members of the House of Lords. However, if you know that a peer member of the House of Lords lives somewhere specific or has spoken about a specific area of the country that they're particularly interested in, then that can work as well to an extent. But I would give an example is a previous MP I worked for had a high concentration of chalk streams in her constituency, and as a result of that, she was very interested in some of the debate and the policy dialogue going on around river pollution, etc. So she was particularly drawn into that issue because she knew it affected her constituency and her constituents. So I think that's a really good way of looking at of any campaign and how you engage with MPs or parliamentarians and how you make your message stand out. Similarly, does the individual in question that you're trying to engage have any previous experience on this issue? So professional experience might be an example, or personal experience. So another MP I worked for, she had been in the military, and she was therefore interested in matters relating to the military, and that's why she ended up picking up a parliamentary campaign around the experiences of women in the military. So she had that experience, she had personal experience of what she was talking about, and she had an interest in it. So that's why she ended up taking it forward. And then finally, is there something that the MP can see do? MPs, lots of people love putting things on social media. MPs aren't the only ones. We're all guilty of it. But if there's something that they can get out of it that can go on their social media, make it clear and offer that to them. As I said earlier, if there's a workshop they can visit, or if there's a site that they can visit, if there's somewhere in their constituency, for example, a river that you can show them, where you can talk to them about river pollution and you can do something active and engaging with them that they can then put on their social media and they can share with their constituents, I think that's always a really good hook. I think there are lots of good hooks for getting MPs involved and parliamentarians involved. Some of it is very unique to those specific parliamentarians that you're engaging with. And I know lots of MPs and other parliamentarians who had very weird and wonderful reasons for why they would or wouldn't do a specific visit, or why they would or wouldn't engage on a certain issue. Sometimes you've just got to give it a go and see, send that email, see what comes back, keep persisting if you don't get there. And I think that's a real lesson as well, is persistence is key with a lot of this. And you may not get a response to your email first time round, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the campaign you're working on isn't important. And it doesn't necessarily mean that your email hasn't just been inadvertently missed. So keep going, keep plugging, and keep trying and to pull as many levers as possible. It's in a sense sometimes a bit of a numbers game. Some of these campaigns and engaging with parliamentarians. So I hope that's given a helpful rundown. Time now for questions. I could see some coming through in the chat, so I will just open up the chat and run through some of those. But if there's any, keep sending any through. If there's any more that you're thinking of, as I'm talking now, and as well, if you want to just shout any out. I mean, I know a lot of you are on mute, but feel free to just shout any out as well if there's any that particularly come to you. Right. Right. Build a increase. How do we keep track of the outcomes of debates? Yes. Um, so I mean, your first point, which I'm really interested in about, sorry, I should have read that out actually for those of you who might not be able to read the chat, or you might be busy doing other things, cooking, cleaning, etc., as I'm often doing when I'm on calls like these. So the question was the bill about increasing legal protection of hedgehogs under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. I tuned in to watch the debate and was really disappointed that it just all sounded like a talking shop. How do we keep track of the outcomes of the debates? So I would firstly say you make a very good point that sometimes it can feel like MPs when they're and peers as well when they're in Parliament talking about things, it can feel like they're just talking to themselves, and it's not necessarily meaningful outcomes that are coming out of it. I think one way in which you well, one thing I would say is actually sometimes having things heard on the floor in Parliament it can be the beginning of something bigger. And I think just because something's mentioned for the first time in Parliament, it doesn't mean it's necessarily going to change the legislation immediately, but it might start a policy making process, or it might start to help people think differently about how something might be achieved, or the process through which campaigners could go to get something done. And I will be honest, I don't know much about the legal protection of hedgehogs under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. However, I can give you an example, a very live example relating to this, which is the assisted dying debate. So the assisted dying debate, it's been going on in the UK for a really, really, really long time. And there have been various opportunities for MPs, parliamentarians to discuss assisted dying. And a lot of those, to all intents and purposes, might have sounded like a talking shop because in many instances, and I remember one of these from I think it was 2023 or 2024, it wasn't even legislation they were debating. It was a general debate, what's called a general debate, which is really an opportunity just for MPs to kind of air their views on a certain issue. So it was a general debate on assisted dying, but it was one of the busiest general debates Parliament had ever witnessed. And just the fact that so many MPs had bothered to show up to that sent a signal that there was people cared about this issue, and it sent a signal that their constituents were writing to them, and it sent a signal that there was a kind of growing voice of a growing voice in the country that of a growing group of people in the country that cared about this issue. So I think you can keep track of debates and the outcomes of debates by one following up specifically with MPs who have spoken on that. So for example, in the assisted dying situation, I recall the MP I worked for, she managed to speak at the time, and then lots of her constituents followed up with her on that, and then continued to follow up with her afterwards to kind of keep pressing the point, keep showing that they cared. So I think actually you should, if something's being debated in Parliament, or you can see it's getting traction in Parliament, but you're not necessarily sure how it's being, where it's going and where it's going next, it's worth you continuing that campaign, and don't let it being spoken about in Parliament be the end point for the campaign. As I said, campaigns and policy making is a really iterative process, and it kind of comes back around. And what you're seeing now with the assisted dying debate is that it is now going through Parliament as a piece of legislation. Whether or not that will actually make it onto the statute books is still debated. It's still quite early in the process, but there has been a shift, and that's because campaigners continued to campaign on the issue, despite the fact that you know there was a debate a couple of years ago, and one a couple of years before that, and another one a couple of years before that, that didn't actually make a specific difference or didn't actually change the law. And I think that's part of it, is some of these big changes, they do take a while to come to fruition. Um, so how do MPs usually respond to letters? So depends on the MP, truth be told. Some MPs, if you write a letter to your MP, and put your email address in there, they may well respond to you directly to your email address. However, they might also write to you back. So I actually worked for an MP who would often respond to all their constituents via letter. So they would always, so even if you emailed in, they would at some point during the process, so it wouldn't necessarily be the first response, it would often be the last response. Um, they would respond via a letter at the end of the process. So, it depends, and I can see you've got a follow-up one there, which was in brackets. We sent two handwritten letters in, no reply, I think. And I think this is, unfortunately, this does happen sometimes, is it really comes down to the office that you are contacting and the MP that you're contacting. Is some are very speedy and very efficient at their responses. Some do take a lot longer. And that's why, as I said, it's partly a numbers game. And I would say don't be disheartened. So I hope that helps. But there's no, I think the other thing to say on this point is there's no rule book for how MPs should respond or correspond with their constituents. So I know of one MP who only allows people to write letters into them, and he only responds via letter. He won't accept any emails in any way whatsoever. Others, as may be the case with this MP that you've written to, might not respond to any of the letters they receive. It could be a kind of office policy. I don't know. But there are no rules for how MPs must engage with their constituents. So that's worth remembering. And then question from Ellen, how do you make an email stand out? So hopefully some of my further points have helped kind of link in with that. But I think one thing that you shouldn't do, one thing I really remember is don't over rely on those campaign emails. So you may have seen, you may have known, you may have done them yourself, campaign emails where you just click on a campaign email or go on a campaign website, put in your details, click send. What that then sends is a generic email to the MP, and that MP might have got, 10, 15, 20. Some of them were getting 500 different emails from constituents on this one campaign. That is a really bad way, unfortunately, in my opinion, of making your own campaign stand out. Because quite often those just seem very impersonal. They don't seem linked to the MP themselves, and they don't always seem very constituency specific. So I'd always try and make it personal to the MP, make it look like you've actually written the email yourself, and make it as constituency specific as possible. I think that always really helps. Um, so hopefully that helps answer your question. How would you recommend engaging with members of the public in person, such as asking farmers and landowners to share their opinions on a topic, e.g., chemical usage, to get locally sourced information before presenting solutions to your MP? That's a really great question. Um, I think I think, for example, with farmers, I know, for example, there are some really good farmers networks out there. So we used to utilize in one of my previous jobs the NFU, the National Farmers Union, because they have really good local networks of farmers. So they can be a really good way of opening up your contacts. So you can leverage them. I don't know if you have a particular contact with your local NFU representative or your regional NFU representative, but they might be a really good way. I think otherwise, other kind of stakeholder groups can be really helpful. I would say try and make your life as easy as possible for yourself, and go for those organizations that have local leverage, so that you're just contacting one organization who might then be able to put you in contact with lots of other people. But I think just more widely, getting locally sourced information before presenting solutions to your MP sounds like a brilliant way of engaging your MP, because what an MP will be looking for if they're looking to support your campaign is, does this matter to, and I've said this earlier, is does this matter to my constituency? Does this matter to the people I represent? And also how is this relevant to my constituency? So if you can go to your MP and say, I've collected this data which shows X, Y, and Z, and this is why it matters to the people you represent, then that's a really good starting point. If I can think of other ways of kind of engaging other folks, I mean, I'm trying to think, but there's often local farmers groups and such like on maybe on social media as well. Or also using the power of individuals who might have a voice in your local community. So, you know, I know of a few, again, linking to a previous role, I know of a few sort of kind of farmer influencers who have quite a loud voice in their own community and the wider farming community. And that could be a really they can be a really good way of sharing what you're um looking to do. Um and getting the view out of what you're hoping to do. That was brilliant, Mark. Thank you. Oh, thank you, Reese. This was we're running a workshop next week for a leadership program. Oh, bro. Well, thanks, Jen. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope your session next week goes well. Feel free to send any you know, if you've got any follow-up questions or any ways in which any of what I've said can be helpful, feel free to get in contact through Ellen. Happy to help and provide any thoughts. Right, just nature-friendly farming network. Yes, thank you, Ellen. That's really helpful. And I think those are probably all the questions, unless I've missed any. Ellen, can you see any that I might have missed?
I don't think so. So if anybody else has any more questions, I was going to go for an hour for this workshop, but I was like, oh, you never know. Maybe I'll add an extra 15 minutes, but I would have timed it so perfectly if I'd gone for an hour. Um,
I think last time we overran a bit, maybe. I think we did go for the full sort of hour and 15 minutes. So it's
I
good,
think we
good
did.
shout for
Yeah.
that.
Um, just lots more people telling you how wonderful you are, Mark, which
Well,
is always
thank you,
nice.
everyone. I'm glad you enjoyed it, and I hope to have imparted at least some wisdom. And yes, Reese, definitely happy to chat. I don't know if you have Ellen's contact details or through whoever. Happy to put, or I can just put my email in the chat if that's easier, and then anyone can. Is that easier?
Yeah, yeah, do that. If you're happy to do that, Mark, that's also grand. I've whacked the UK Youth for Nature email in there just in case anybody wants to get in touch with us. But if you want to go directly to Mark, that cuts out the middleman
Just
or
check.
middle woman,
Yeah, there we
middle
go.
person.
That's my email. So very happy to take any follow-up questions, can chat over a call or a Teams meeting or a Zoom or whatever. Happy to do that in due course if anyone has any questions.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm gonna stop recording.